Super Mario Odyssey is almost a decade old. In that time, it has cemented itself as one of video games' greatest 3D platformers, immediately soaring its way to critical acclaim upon release. 8 years later, and there are still thousands of people who continue to flock to this game as it is filled to the brim with unique experiences. But in that same amount of time, speedrunners have completely dismantled this game. It is both beautiful and disgusting just how broken this game really is, and after almost a decade of activity, there are no signs of Odyssey slowing down anytime soon. So after almost 2 years of me procrastinating this project, I am finally ready to share with you all one of video games' greatest journeys. This is the history of Darker Side World Records. Mario Odyssey has 17 kingdoms. In order to beat the game, you need to collect a total of 124 moons so that you can then go to Moon Kingdom and defeat Bowser. The game is officially beaten when you shoot out of this wire at the end of Bowser's escape sequence. Once you beat the game, you unlock the Mushroom Kingdom alongside these moon rocks in the other 14 kingdoms. Breaking the moon rocks will give you access to the rest of the game's moons, which can then help us unlock the remaining 2 kingdoms, which are Dark and Darker Side respectively. In order to unlock Darker Side, you need to collect 500 moons, which is half of the game's total moon counter. To put things into perspective, it takes about an hour to beat the game, and as I said earlier, beating the game requires a minimum of 124 moons. So if you do the math, it should take about 4 times the amount of time, or 4 hours, to unlock the Darker Side. But this math is a bit flawed because not only do we have to factor in the completion of Darker Side itself, we also have to factor in the actual moons we're collecting. Since we're collecting 4 times the amount of moons, the rate at which we collect these moons will be bound to slow down at some points in the run, as there can only be so many quick moons. Every kingdom has a sequence of story missions, various minigames, and RNG or luck dependent moons. Would speedrunners be able to route out all of these slow moons? And how exactly does one go about collecting 500 moons as fast as possible? Do you collect as much as you can in each kingdom before moving on, or is it faster to unlock everything as soon as possible? Following Odyssey's release, the first Darker Side world records were essentially casual playthroughs of the game. While it was still impressive that people were able to complete this challenge in such close proximity to the game's release, it was clear that there was loads of room for improvement, as the first world record clocked in at a time of 9 hours and 38 minutes. After 2 weeks, the record was improved by 3 hours, with Mistwalker MX7 getting a time of 6 hours and 34 minutes. But a few days after this, Spike Vegeta would almost cut the world record in half, submitting a time of 4 hours, 25 minutes, and 54 seconds. This was the first submitted world record to really iron out the details of this speedrun. Not only did it have a solidified route, it also made ample use of Mario's moveset. Mario's moveset consists of 2 components, the first being Mario himself, and the second being any captures he interacts with. Just about every move in the action guide has some sort of use throughout the run. Spike uses motion control rolling to travel horizontal distance in a timely manner, and any other challenges are faced either with various moves Mario can perform, or Cappy, who essentially has a moveset of his own. Not only can you bounce off of Cappy to get an extra jump, you can use motion controls to do up throws, down throws, spin throws, and homing cap throws. While Spike doesn't make use of all of these techniques, his movement still remains very impressive even by today's standards, with the route itself being even more impressive. Before beating the game, Spike opts for completing the story missions in just about every kingdom, which makes sense because not only are you able to collect a bunch of moons on the way to each mission, some of the missions themselves give multi-moons, meaning that 3 moons will be added to your total moon counter as opposed to 1. Once Spike gets to Moon Kingdom, he pulls off one of the game's earliest and most infamous tricks, which is none other than Moon Cave Skip. In a casual playthrough, you are expected to cross this entire cave before reaching the top of the Moon Kingdom, but with Moon Cave Skip, that is no longer the case. Once Spike completes the game, the grandeur of his route really starts to shine. Previous world records would lose a lot of time as a result of backtracking, missing moons, and using the Odyssey to go back and forth between kingdoms. But with Spike's route, he used these paintings to travel from kingdom to kingdom, which skipped his need to constantly dump moons into the Odyssey. Once Spike was on the verge of unlocking the darker side, he went back to the Mushroom Kingdom so that he could talk to Toadette. Toadette is responsible for giving you these achievement moons, which can vary from getting a certain amount of jumps, completing specific challenges, or even as far as completing every story mission. Since there are about 30 or so achievement moons we collect from Toadette at the end of the run, Spike has to make sure that he doesn't miss a single achievement. Once the final achievement moon is collected, Spike will have just enough moons to make it to the darker side. Darker Side is easily the most punishing kingdom in the entire game. This linear platforming gauntlet gets progressively harder the further you get into it. If you fail at any point, then you will be sent all the way back to the beginning, instantly killing any shot at a world record. Luckily for Spike, there are a few skips he can take advantage of that will make his Darker Side experience just a tad bit easier. Once he makes it to this uproot section, he is able to use the uproot to skip this underwater fuzzy section. After a little more platforming, Spike makes it to this platform with the Scarecrow. Capturing the Scarecrow will usually result in this happening, but if you capture the Scarecrow from a distance, it will result in the platform shooting straight up, which then leaves us to one of Darker Side's biggest skips. In a casual playthrough, this part of Darker Side is an approximate halfway point, as you'd still have to fly through these tornadoes, fling these forks, avoid these lasers, fling this bird, beat Donkey Kong, enter this Bowser painting, dodge these boulders, and then and only then can you access the final section of the kingdom. But if you time a motion control shake near the bottom of this tornado, you are able to do this. This is Glide On Skip, and as you can see, it brings you right to the end. From here, all Spike has to do is ride these pylons all the way to this pipe, and from there, he can use this frog to make it all the way to the top of this building, and ultimately, beat Darker Side. Spike had successfully set the new standard for Darker Side. With a solidified route alongside the inclusion of more technical movement, other speedrunners now had a reference point, but since this was still a 4-hour run, there was still loads of room for improvement, with Spike improving his record by 14.5 minutes over the course of a few days as a result of cleaner execution alongside a few slight route tweaks. But in that same week, Darker Side would change forever. Within the first few weeks of the game being out, players somehow found a way to skip all of Darker Side. This is Frog Skip, and the skip itself is pretty trivial. You jump with one frog, uncapture, then bounce on the other frog before capturing it. Once this is done, the game will be tricked into thinking the frog is in the water, meaning that you could swim right to the end. Another speedrunner, who goes by the name of Odyssey, would quickly get a new world record with the skip, getting a time of 4:04:12. With more and more speedrunners gravitating towards Darker Side, it now became a question of who would be the first to complete a run in under 4 hours. This is Samurai One Man, and as you can tell, his movement was simply on another level. Since he had already catapulted himself to world record level in other domains of Odyssey, it is no surprise that he was able to snatch this world record. But since Samu was more interested in other things the game had to offer, he'd quickly move on from Darker Side. This put the heavy lifting back onto other players, with Odyssey and 360 Chrism trading the world record back and forth over the next 2 weeks. Odyssey would eventually come out on top with a 348.58, but something interesting would happen around this time. When Mario is rolling, he only has two ways of getting out of that roll. You can either let go of the crouch button, or you can press jump, which will cause Mario to long jump. But a few weeks after Odyssey's release, it was figured out that there was a third way to get out of a roll. If you press both jump and cappy at the same time, then you are able to exit out of the roll while still preserving your speed from rolling, which leads us to this pyramid in Sand Kingdom. If you do a roll cancel here, the speed you preserve from it, alongside the slope that you are under, will allow for you to clip straight through the wall. By doing this clip, Oddme no longer had to go out of his way to unlock the pyramid, meaning that even if you took multiple tries to get the clip, it would still result in a huge amount of time saved, as the Shards Moon in particular is ridiculously slow. Oddme then uses the roll cancel clip, or RCC, a second time in the Snow Kingdom. By doing this clip, he is able to go straight to this area, which is home to this kingdom's final story mission. Once again, this RCC saves a bunch of time, as the intended way of unlocking the Bound Bowl consists of you clearing all 4 of these sub areas. Despite both of these tricks being new, Oddme was able to get both of them with relative ease, but outside of that, there were still kingdoms that lost minutes upon minutes of time as a result of execution. Remember that first world record that was completed in 9 hours and 38 minutes? That run was completed by JCool114, and while it may seem like JCool just dipped after that first world record, the truth was that he was lurking in the shadows the entire time, getting times that were just short of the world record. But after Oddme's 348, JCool would finally break through with a 348 of his own, and in the weeks to follow, he would improve the record to a 346, followed up by a 345. The most impressive part about these world records was that JCool made the decision not to go for the 2 RCCs that Oddme went for in his world record. JCool simply made less mistakes, displaying a level of skill that allowed for him to beat the world record while losing minutes from opting out of the RCCs. But on December 28th of 2017, Darker Side would gain its first king. It wasn't Oddme, it wasn't Samu, it wasn't Spike, it wasn't Chrism, and it wasn't JCool. This player would be none other than Anthonoosh. Coming hot out of Canada, Antho had made a decision to put all of his time into this category, getting his first world record on December 28th of 2017. What was to follow would be a reign of world records that would completely change the trajectory of Darker Side. But before I get into that, I think it's about time we take a deep dive into Darker Side's route. Cap 1 and Cascade 1 are pretty self-explanatory, with the only trick being Dino Skip. Using this trampoline, you are able to propel yourself up to the Madame Brood boss fight without having to go through this 2D section. Sand 1 is when this run really starts to heat up. Antho starts off by collecting a few moons in the town, and right before he leaves the town, he plants this seed. He then collects a few more moons before pulling off inverted pyramid clip on the 3rd try. Once he's in the pyramid, he collects a few more moons before fighting Harriet. Every boss fight has a way of being defeated early, and Harriet is no exception. When Harriet throws her bomb, you are able to hit it with Cappy in midair to get a fast hat off. This will then cause Harriet to fly around the arena, dropping bombs, but this too can be sped up if you quickly hit the first bomb Harriet drops. When Antho makes it to Bowser's Kingdom, he will use the same techniques to defeat Harriet, with the only difference being that he will have more bombs to dodge. Once Harriet is defeated, Antho unlocks phase 2 of the Sand Kingdom, which is Night Sand. In older Darker Side runs, players would climb all the way up to this tower to collect this story moon, but since Antho did IP clip, he is able to take this spark pylon all the way up to the top of the tower, and he will instead save this Shards moon for when he revisits Sand Kingdom, as defeating Harriet is the only requirement for unlocking this kingdom's final boss. After this moon is collected, Antho makes his way to the underground temple so that he can fight Knuckleattack. By aiming his fists into these blocks of ice, you are able to capture his hand and ultimately give him a knuckle sandwich. This boss fight isn't anything too crazy, but it can be very punishing if you mess up at any point, and you'll have to wait for Knuckle to drop all of his ice blocks again. Once Knuckle is defeated, we get to one of the most important parts of the run. After Sand, you have a choice as to whether or not you want to go to Lake or Wooded Kingdom first. If you accidentally select the wrong kingdom, then the run is instantly over. These proverbial forks in the road will influence the kingdoms these paintings lead to. So if you choose Wooded or Seaside first, then the rest of the route will no longer work, as the paintings connecting each kingdom will lead to the wrong kingdoms. Lake Kingdom is pretty short, but we are once again introduced to another boss fight. When Rango throws out his hat, you're supposed to use the flower underneath it to float onto his head, but with some relatively basic movement, you are able to hit his head without the flower. You are then able to prevent him from jumping around the arena if you hit his head right as he's about to do his first jump, making this boss fight pretty quick. Antho also views his first hint art. Hint arts will be viewed throughout the run, as later on in post-game, they will be really fast moons to collect, considering the fact that most of them are easily attainable if you already know where the moon is located. Wooded Kingdom doesn't have any flashy tricks, but it is notorious for how technically challenging it is. There are a lot of large gaps Antho will have to cover, with the hardest of these gaps being after you collect this first story moon. By doing a roll cancel, followed up by a well-timed triple jump, you are able to skip this flower road. You could then skip another flower road to make it to this tower. At the top of the tower is Spewer, who is the fourth and final brutal. What makes Wooded Kingdom so dangerous is the deep woods. While there are certain places in which you can avoid falling into the deep woods, falling into the deep woods is one of the biggest mistakes you can make, as these beanstalks are the only way out. Luckily for Antho, he avoids falling into the deep woods and makes his way to Torque Drift. By timing your jumps with the uproot, and more specifically, timing your jumps off of slopes, you are able to get boosts in speed, but other than that, this fight is pretty trivial. The next two kingdoms, which are Cloud and Lost respectively, are home to two of Mario Odyssey's most classic tricks. When you're fighting Bowser in Cloud Kingdom, the intention is that you are supposed to wait for him to throw his hat before capturing it. With a well-timed jump and cap throw, you are able to skip this entirely on all three phases of the fight, both in this kingdom and in Moon Kingdom as well. When it comes to Lost Kingdom, Klepto will steal your hat as soon as you enter the main part of the kingdom, triggering this sequence in which you need to climb all the way up to these stairs so that you can get your hat back. With some clever movement, you can avoid this entire interaction with Klepto. If you triple jump off of this tree, you'll have just enough height to clear this distance. From there, you can circle around the kingdom until you make it to Klepto's stairs. If you go anywhere within this vicinity, Klepto will be tricked into thinking that he has your hat, meaning that you can now traverse the rest of the kingdom without triggering Klepto. Metro 1 consists of 4 sections. There's Night Metro, the Musicians, the Sewer, and the Festival. At the end of Night Metro, you are tasked with fighting the Mecha Wiggler, which is arguably one of the most technical boss fights in the entire game. There are 3 phases to this fight, but with good aim, you can skip the 3rd phase in its entirety. This in itself isn't too difficult, but what makes this boss fight so technical is the 2nd phase of the fight. There are 22 possible patterns the Wiggler can have on its 2nd phase, and the pattern you get is completely out of your control. While some patterns are easy, others can be brutal, making it much more difficult to avoid the Wiggler's 3rd phase. Even though Antho wasn't able to get a 2-cycle Mecha Wiggler, the rest of the kingdom went smoothly, putting him over a minute ahead. Similar to IP Clip, Antho was able to get the Clip in Snow on the 3rd try as well. Now don't be mistaken, Antho will still visit each of these rooms to collect some quick moons. The main reason as to why the clip saves so much time lies within the fact that you can skip this room, which skips both this moon alongside this fight with Rango. The bound bowl itself is surprisingly optimized. By timing your jumps on the bottom of these slopes, you are able to maximize both your speed and your distance. Antho lost about 10 seconds to an optimal bound bowl, which goes to show how time loss in small parts of the run can very quickly add up to minutes upon minutes of time save. See Seaside Kingdom is the first to really put a lot of emphasis on the captures as opposed to Mario. In this case, Antho uses the Gushin to skip large parts of the kingdom, and later on when he revisits Seaside Kingdom, he will use the Cheep Cheep to collect most moons in the kingdom. Before unlocking Squidward, there are 4 levers you must hit, each of which are attached to story moons. 2 of these moons are still done the intended way, but the other 2 are completely glossed over, as you skip both of this lighthouse alongside this rolling rocks section. The Gusher is then used again to bring peace to Seaside Kingdom. Similar to the other big kingdoms, Luncheon Kingdom is a very challenging one, as there is once again a heavy emphasis on execution, a trend that will continue for most of the run. Once you get to the end of Luncheon, you are then met with one of the most frustrating fights in the entire game. In addition to this soup being really hard to navigate, Cockatiel's hitboxes are just bad. It's not a difficult fight in terms of technicality, but when things go wrong, it becomes really difficult to recover. This leaves us with the last 3 kingdoms out of the first 14, which are Ruined Kingdom, Bowser's Kingdom, and Moon Kingdom. Ruined Kingdom is essentially an auto-scroller, but in Bowser's Kingdom, you fight what I believe to be this game's true final boss. Using the Pokio, you're supposed to hit the mech's legs with the bombs it shoots out, so that you can then knock it over and poke each of the Brutal's bubbles. Each time you break a bubble, the mech will eject you so that it can transition into its next phase. But if you do a cap bounce at the apex of the mech's ejection, you are able to land back on top of it again. This means that you can do the entire boss fight without the Pokio, as you can climb the mech's leg on the first phase and then stay on the top for phases 2, 3, and 4. Since Antho knew he had lots of time to save later on in the run, he opted to go for a safer version of the fast mech, which involves using the Pokio to get on top of the mech after the first phase, as opposed to doing this climb. From here on out, Darker Side becomes a 2-hour movement gauntlet, and it is nothing short of glorious. Once you beat Moon Kingdom, the route is as follows. You collect a few moons in Mushroom, take a painting in the snow, then Cascade, Bowser's, Seaside, Lake, Sand, Metro, Wooded, Luncheon, and then back to Mushroom again. Once Antho is back in Mushroom, he dumps all of his moons into the Odyssey, collecting the remaining moons through revisits to Cap, Lost, Moon, and Mushroom Kingdom. As I alluded to earlier, this part of the run is essentially a giant collectathon. As time progresses, post-game will only become more and more absurd, but for now, there are a few basics to go over. For starters, there are various fish moons that Antho will collect. When the fish tugs on your bait, your controller will vibrate, which is your cue to reel the fish in. The only issue is that the fish will also do fake tugs. The amount of fake tugs the fish does is completely luck-based, but because getting a tug within the first few tries is so quick, there was just no way that speedrunners were going to get rid of these moons, even if the consequences of getting bad luck were really bad. Over the next week, Antho would set a new world record almost every single day, with each record improving the last by large margins, starting with a 340, then a 335, another 335, followed up by a 333.59. But on January 9th of 2018, a new runner would once again step up to the plate, beating Antho by a mere 12 seconds. But the very next day, Antho's reign would once again continue. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Shaden, but if you are not, then allow me to share his story. Around the same time that Antho was setting all of these world records, Shaden was completely dominating this game's main category, which entails beating the game as fast as possible, otherwise known as any percent. Even though there were thousands of people competing for this world record, Shaden was simply on another level, completely decimating any and all competition that came his way. Since there are so many layers to Odyssey, every speedrunner had their own unique playstyle. Some players were good at implementing new strategies, while other players such as J. Cool opted for consistency with older strategies. Shaden embodies both sides of this double-edged sword, allowing for him to set record after record. Not only was he a really consistent player, he would always be one of the first people to add any new tricks into the run. On top of that, he was one of the first people to really start making making use of Mario Odyssey's more advanced techniques, whether it be roll canceling, up throwing, or spin pounding. By doing a spin, followed up by the inputs of a ground pound, you are able to pull off a spin pound, which serves as a faster ground pound. Not to mention that a spin pound will allow Mario to instantaneously get the maximum rolling speed, even if Mario's speed is at 0. After a few months, Shaden would disappear from Odyssey and was to never be seen again. Antho was the Shaden of Darker Side. He had completely taken over the category, improving his execution with every single world record, while simultaneously displaying more and more mastery over the game's various tricks. But after his 327, he was to never be seen again. Before Antho took over Darker Side, a lot of the previous world record holders already had extensive backgrounds in speedrunning. In particular, Spike, Oddme, Chrism, J-Cool, and Samu were all top-level speedrunners in various games. Some of them were even world record holders, with Samu being notorious for his world records in Super Mario Sunshine. These runners were able to catapult themselves to the top as a result of their past speedrunning experience transferring over to Odyssey. Even Shaden ended up being a previous world record holder in Ocarina of Time, only that his alias back then was Pydoix as opposed to Shaden, which is why people initially thought he was some nobody who just magically showed up, decimated the game, and then left. 7 years later, and nobody really knows who Antho is or where he went. He showed up as a nobody with no speedrunning experience, got 9 world records in the span of a month, and then left. For the next 2 weeks, the world record would remain untouched, creating the longest streak of record inactivity since the game had come out. At the end of those 2 weeks, Samu would once again reclaim the world record with a 20-second improvement. But for the rest of 2018, Bayleaf would be Darker Side's new champion. Bayleaf was the only player who was able to beat Antho while he was still active, but after this world record by Samu, he'd go on a rampage of his own, breaking multiple minute barriers within the span of 2 months. Around the same time, Darker Side would be faced with its biggest controversy. When Frog Skip was initially discovered, a lot of community members called for the leaderboard to be split. One category would allow the use of Frog Skip, while the other would not, as some players felt that the use of Frog Skip defeated the purpose of Darker Side. In February of 2018, version 1.2 of Odyssey would be released, patching Frog Skip among a plethora of other tricks. This once again caused the leaderboard to split, with most players sticking to 1.0 or 1.1 as those versions of the game were simply better. Even though it had already been 2 months since 1.2 came out, Bayleaf still continued to play on 1.1, but in the summer of 2018, he made the switch to 1.2, meaning that he would no longer get the 3 minutes of time save from Frog Skip. Now 1.2 didn't patch any tricks that were done in Darker Side specifically, but it did make some of them harder, such as these roll cancels. While 1.2 had harder roll cancel clips, this version of the game would be the first to introduce Luigi hint arts. These hint arts are placed all throughout the game, with each hint art being worth 200 coins. Bayleaf will collect these all throughout the run, allowing him to save some of the time he loses from being on 1.2. But Bayleaf had gotten so good at the game that he was able to demolish his previous world record without the use of Frog Skip.
I've done it! I am the legend that got the first sub 320. Oh, I almost had it. Almost had it. Alright, there we go, dude.
In the span of a few months, Darkerside had undergone a massive transformation, with Bayleaf being at the head of it all. Instead of avoiding the deep woods, Bayleaf went straight to them at the start of the kingdom, meticulously exiting out of the woods using this beanstalk so that he can swiftly continue on with this route. Since he now has the extra moons he collected in the deep woods, he exits the kingdom upon fighting Spewart, saving the fight against Torque Drift for Wooded 2, as the painting you spawn out of is right next to that boss fight. Around this same time, it was discovered that going to Wooded first saved 3 seconds over going to Lake, meaning that the painting route later on in the run will be a bit different. In Lost Kingdom, Bayleaf goes for a deceptively difficult trick. To get this key, and therefore get this moon, you are supposed to use the Wiggler to stretch all the way out to the key. With a well-timed homing cap throw, you are able to collect the key as Mario, and then capture an enemy right before he falls into the poison. Since Bayleaf was already using Glydon to collect this moon on the island, he can fly to this key moon and ultimately use Glydon to pull off the trick. At face value, this trick doesn't look too difficult, but it quickly became one of Darkerside's notorious run killers. If you pulled off the trick first try, then you'd save a few seconds, but every death to the trick would lose about 30, meaning that even just one death would be enough to constitute a reset from Bayleaf. He could have easily opted out of going for strategies like this, as a few seconds saved over the course of a 3-hour run would not be worth it to most if the consequence was killing the run, but it was clear that he was going to do as many strategies as he could. This isn't to say that there were strategies he didn't go for, as he definitely opted to play it safe in certain sections, but nonetheless, there were only 2 large tricks that Bayleaf was avoiding, and the first of these tricks would be Sewer Clip. By doing a roll cancel on this pipe, you can skip the sewer in its entirety. Now the trick doesn't save as much time as you'd think, since doing this clip means you have to replace this moon, but if it saved a lot more time than this trick in Lost Kingdom, then why was Bayleaf not going for it in his runs? There could be a multitude of answers to this question, but the main one lies within the nerf roll cancels received on 1.2. These 2 clips had already become way more inconsistent since the conception of 1.2, with Bayleaf losing about 20 seconds to the one in Snow alone. With the trick in Lost Kingdom, it was arduous, but at least it had the ability to be consistent, unlike Sewer Clip. The other trick Bayleaf was avoiding was the Moon Clip. Discovered by complete accident in the summer of 2018, the Moon Clip was easily one of the most broken exploits in the entire game. By doing a backflip, followed up by a cap throw that is timed right before you collect the moon, you are able to use that same moon to push Mario through the wall, which brings us back to Snow Kingdom. Instead of doing this RCC, it would have been much faster for Bayleaf to do this Moon Clip. In Cascade Kingdom, you can do another moon clip to get to the Odyssey faster, and in Ruin Kingdom, you could do a moon clip to get to this Spark Pylon faster. In Wooded Kingdom, you can use the moon clip to go straight to this Nut Moon, which saves a plethora of time over pulling this lever, waiting for the gate, and capturing this uproot. While some of these moon clips were more lenient in comparison to these RCCs, the downside is that you only have one try to hit them, putting a lot of pressure on the player to not mess it up. In Seaside Kingdom, you may remember all the time Anthos spent chasing this guy around. In Bayleaf's record, he had a strategy that involved cleverly trapping the boss. Through some clever manipulation, Bayleaf is able to manipulate the boss to take a straight line to this part of the map. Once the manipulation is done, he uses the Gushin to spray Squidward, which will then cause him to enter phase 3 of the fight. Phase 3 is usually where all of the chasing would take place, but since Squidward is in this weird spot, he will clip out of bounds into this wall, effectively slowing him down to the point where Bayleaf can ground pound his head and finish the fight. Once Bayleaf gets to post game, he ends up getting godlike luck in fishing. While he did get a 4th try tug in Sand Kingdom, he got a 1st try tug on both the Snow and Lake fishing moons, which almost never happens in a run. In Wooded 2, Bayleaf ends up going for an even riskier bird cycle, with the rest of his post game heavily improving upon the fluidity and consistency displayed displayed within Antho's world records. In particular, Bayleaf usually had some sort of skip, albeit small or large, that he would use across the various sub-areas he has to visit in postgame. In Cascade Kingdom, he not only skips these clouds, he then collects the secret moon without circling around. In Bowser's Kingdom, he brings the statue to this P-switch, completely skipping all of the other switches the game wants you to hit with some clever movement. In Seaside Kingdom, Bayleaf uses this Koopa shell to collect these music notes, and in Wooded Kingdom, he uses the bullet bill to completely decimate this sub-area. In Sand Kingdom, Bayleaf completely skips over the Moai in this sub-area, and in Luncheon Kingdom, Bayleaf takes full advantage of Cappy, whether it be fast movement with the lava bubbles or the forks. While Antho already did a lot of these things, Bayleaf had completely upped the ante. Near the end of 2018, Bayleaf decided to submit Darker Side into Awesome Games Done Quick, which is the biggest speedrunning event in the world. Because Darker Side wasn't as popular as Odyssey's other categories, he was fully expecting his submission to be left in the dust, but to his dismay, he had been accepted into AGDQ 2019. On the right of the couch was Tippy, who was the world record holder in both All Moons and 100% at the time, and on the left of the couch was the one and only Spike Vegeta. Early on into the run, Bayleaf had killed any shot at breaking the world record, as he lost about a minute and a half to that trick in Lost Kingdom. But as the run continued, something magical began to happen. There are two purposes behind Games Done Quick. The first is to give speedrunners an opportunity to show off their skills in front of a large crowd, while the couch gives a play-by-play of what is happening. But the second and more important purpose is to raise money for charity. At the start of Bayleaf's run, the marathon had already raised $1.7 million, but since Odyssey was the second to last game of the marathon, tens of thousands of people started tuning into the stream to make their last-minute donations to charity.
We're doing a couple backup moons.
Yeah, it's fine.
Just okay, cuz 6!
I'm saying.
2!
Oh, I'm not gonna win this. It's over.
2!
What?
It's okay, buddy. Don't get him next time.
Twitch chat's too fast.
Time. Let's go, baby. Let's go.
Oh, that's Pokemon.
In the span of 3 hours, $300,000 had been raised for charity, creating for one of the most iconic moments in speedrunning history. 6 years later, and this run is by far the most viewed speedrun on the GDQ YouTube channel, clocking in at 6.1 million views, with the live stream itself peaking at around 170,000 concurrent viewers. After GDQ, Bayleaf would continue to improve the world record without Frog Skip, but in March of 2019, someone would finally beat Bayleaf, even if it was with Frog Skip, and that person would be Neo. While Bayleaf had a 3:15 in Darker Side without Frog Skip, he had managed to get a 3:14.06 with it in October of 2018, which is the equivalent to a 3:17 without Frog Skip. So when you factor this in, it's no surprise that Bayleaf was able to quickly beat Neo, but nonetheless, Neo proved that Bayleaf was not alone at the top. In the subsequent month, Odyssey would once again receive an update, except this time, the update had a massive impact on Darker Side. While the changes made in 1.2 still held true in 1.3, the game's loads were now much faster. Faster to the point in which Frog Skip was no longer a relevant time save. From now on, everyone would run on 1.3, officially making no Frog Skip the superior category. Come the summer of 2019, and Bayleaf would bring the world record all the way down to a 3:11.47. After a year and a half of dominating the category, Bayleaf finally made the decision to move on. Since 2019, Bayleaf has dabbled in all sorts of various video game challenges, even going as far as to set world records in other games such as Astro's Playroom, but there is no overstating just how much he did for this game. While his reign of world records is remarkable, he had managed to bring Darkerside to the big stage, igniting a newfound spark for the category that was larger than anyone could have ever imagined, while simultaneously raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for charity. With an era as exciting as Bayleaf, would Darkerside be able to live up to all of this newfound hype? Over the next few months, Neo would steadily improve upon Bayleaf's previous world record, getting a time of 3:11.08, which was then followed up by a 3:10.45. It was clear that Darkerside was starting to become optimized, as the major time losses in this record only added up to about a minute. There were 17 seconds lost in Snow, 17 in Metro 2, 14 in Bowser's 2, 13 in Mech, and 11 in Darkerside. Neo was more than capable of achieving the first ever 309, but right behind him was a player who had been lurking in the shadows for a very long time. All throughout 2018, this player was steadily improving their time in every mainboard category. By the time 2019 rolled around, they had become a dominant world record holder in 2 out of the 6 mainboard categories, while simultaneously holding a respectable time in the other 4 categories. This player would be none other than Dangers, and in September of 2019, he decided to put all of his focus into Darkerside. Even though he had already cemented himself as a top-level player at this point, the idea of a world record was still far away at the beginning of September. But over the next few months, Dangers would become dangerous. Oh man.
We did it.
Oh, man.
That's okay, I'll take that. Oh, and we even golded the Darkerside split. Would you look at that? It's a PB.
3 hours, 8 minutes, and 25 seconds. This world record, while far from perfect, managed to nicely piece together all of the new techniques that had been discovered over the last 2 years. Within the first 2 minutes of the run, Dangers is already at an advantage when compared to previous world record holders. Not only does he have a better grasp over Mario's moveset, he ends up going for left side, which saves 2 seconds over the alternative. In Cascade Kingdom, Dangers goes for another trick, except this time around, the trick can save upwards of 10 seconds. By complete accident, someone figured out that Mario could land on this tiny slither of ground. The only problem is that recreating this would require a great deal of precision that was not worth dealing with in a 3-hour-long speedrun. But then Dangers came along, pulling off the trick first try in his world record, before it was even done in Odyssey's more popular and optimized categories. By scaling up this wall, Dangers is then able to make it to the top of this rib cage. Since he is now at the top of the kingdom, he can go straight to Madame Brood without having to use this dinosaur. In Wooded Kingdom, Dangers goes for one of the tricks Bayleaf was avoiding, which would be none other than the moon clip. By doing this clip, Dangers is able to go straight to this moon, skipping both this gate and uproot capture in the process. As the run continued on, Dangers gained more and more time save, putting himself 30 seconds ahead of his previous time. With a lead as comfortable as this one, Dangers made the decision to opt out of Sewer Clip, exiting Snow Kingdom with a 28-second lead after nailing this moon clip. While Luncheon Ruined and Moon Kingdom aren't all too much different from what we have already seen, the same cannot be said as far as Bowser's Kingdom is concerned. For a long time, there was a particular order in which these moon shards were collected: Shard 1, Shard 2, Shard 3, Shard 4, and Shard 5. If you swap the order of Shards 1 and 2, you are then able to collect Shards 3 and 4 faster. During the Harriet boss fight, Dangers will use the camera to properly line Mario up, so that he can then hold out Cappy at an angle that will cause the bomb to self-implode on Harriet. But more impressively, Dangers goes for a variety of risky strategies to speed up the Mecha Brutal boss fight. Not only does he do a better job of climbing up the mech's leg, he then switches the order of bubbles 3 and 4. So instead of landing on top of the mech to ground pound the final bubble, Dangers will do this dangerous spin pound, all for a second of time save. Unfortunately for Dangers, he would bleed a lot of time in post-game, losing 25 seconds to fishing in both Sand and Lake 2, alongside a minute lost to movement errors across all of post-game. But since the first half of his run was so good, he was still able to clutch out a new world record by 9 seconds. Post-game has many elements, some of which I've already mentioned. There's loads of rigorous movement sections, sub-areas, NPCs, and fishing. But there's one big element that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the leaps of faith. For a long time, the darker side route operated in a way in which almost all of these jumps were avoided, but now that it was 2019, these leaps of faith were no longer avoidable. A lot of these jumps save a lot of time, but on the offside, failing any of them will lose an obscene amount of time. The first of these jumps is in Snow Kingdom, in which we do this vault to make it up to the cascade painting as opposed to using this Taifu. For Mario to get a vault off of this slope, Cappy needs to be placed in a pretty weird spot. If Cappy is too high, you will slide on the slope, and if you are too low, you'll get a cap bounce as opposed to a vault. In Wooded Kingdom, there are 3 jumps that are easier than the one in Snow, but nonetheless, they lose more time if you miss them. The first one involves using this rocket flower and ramp to jump halfway across the map just to talk to Toad, and the second involves getting this nut moon, which is deceptively easy to miss. The final leap of faith is a triple jump to this moon in the sky, which is also very easy to miss, especially with the nerves that come with being 2 hours into a 3-hour run. The reason as to why these jumps are scarier, despite being easier, comes with the fact that messing any of them up will not only come with the time loss of falling to the bottom of the kingdom, or in this case, falling to your death, but it will also come with the time loss of missing this bird cycle. You may think that this is not that big of a deal, as you can warp to the top of the kingdom and then find another moon to replace the bird with, but the only problem with this is that we get a Toadette achievement for collecting 5 bird moons, so missing this moon really means that we are missing 2 moons while simultaneously messing up the route. In Metro Kingdom, we have an almost identical scenario to what I just described in Wooded Kingdom. We do this risky jump to collect a floating moon, which is then followed up by another jump that will have Mario landing on top of this traffic light so that we can collect another bird moon. There is also a point in the kingdom in which we have to drive this scooter off the top of a building, and if you hop off of the scooter at the right time, the scooter will land exactly where it needs to land. This isn't really all that relevant since it only saves a few seconds and is almost never pulled off in runs, but it is arguably the most badass among all the leaps of faith. This leaves us with 3 more leaps of faith to finish out the run. In Legend Kingdom, we use this timer challenge to make it over to this Toad, and in Cap Kingdom, we do this jump on the sign to make it over to this Moon Rock. In the Mushroom Kingdom, we do one last leap of faith with this Goomba, using a well-timed jump alongside this slope to clear the gap of water. It's also worth mentioning that 2 tricks from Any% had now made their debut in the darker side route. In Metro 2, Dangers hops on this scooter and tilts his controller at a 90-degree angle. Doing this ever so slightly extends the hitbox of the scooter, allowing for us to collect this moon without the RC car. In Seaside Kingdom, there is this invisible wall that is supposed to prevent you from swimming out of bounds, but in this particular spot of the kingdom, Dangers is able to use this Cheep Cheep to bypass the wall. Since the Cheep Cheep's hitbox extends itself upon doing a shake, Dangers is then able to collect this moon while staying out of bounds, which then allows him to enter this loading zone without having to answer the Sphinx's question. For the rest of 2019, Darker Side's world record would remain untouched. Dangers himself said that a 307 was more than possible, with a 306 being a time that could be realistically achieved through cleaning up mistakes. But on March 8th of 2020, Minyush, who had already built a reputation for discovering new tricks, would casually post one of Odyssey's biggest tricks. Outside of the inverted pyramid are these icicles you can get on top of. If you get on top of this icicle, you can do this jump that puts you on the outskirts of the pyramid's 2D section. It was known that you could do this for a long time, but what wasn't known was that you could then do this. players can now get to the top of the inverted pyramid without ever stepping foot inside of it. Once top level players started trying the trick, the general consensus was that IP skip was not going to be added into runs for a very long time. While this first jump is pretty trivial, clipping into the pyramid was wildly inconsistent. If Mario was too far to the right, then you would be able to quickly try to skip again, but if Mario was too far to the left, you would fall all the way back down. Even if Mario clips into the pyramid, it can be very easy to either fall down or clip back into bounds, making IP skip one of Odyssey's hardest and most frustrating tricks, which is why 2 weeks later, Dangers would pull it off first try in a run.
What the fuck? Okay! Holy fuck.
It would have been one thing to just get IP skip in a record, but the fact that he got it on the first try has got to be one of the biggest fuck you moments to anyone else trying to claim this world record. He barely had any time to practice the trick since it had only been out for a few weeks and there was no setup to use. But what is even more impressive was the fact that he was able to cruise through the remaining 3 hours of the run as if he didn't just hit one of the hardest tricks in the game on the first try. It's important to remember that while we are skipping the inverted pyramid, we are also skipping the 2 moons we'd usually collect while inside the pyramid. This was another reason as to why players were hesitant to do the trick, as they thought the risk to reward ratio was simply not worth it. But since those 2 moons inside the inverted pyramid are really slow, Dangers is able to make up for it in Luncheon 3, netting him about 20 seconds of time save. 5 years later, and Dangers is still making strides in Odyssey, yet his darker side time still remains a 3:07:15. Maybe one day he'll return to the category to reclaim his glory, but as far as his impact is concerned, Dangers had a streak of world records that lasted for an entire year, with his 3:07:15 being the magnum opus. All the way back in 2017, a speedrunner who was known for his world records in Super Mario Galaxy, among his other gaming achievements, decided to give Odyssey a shot. Like most people, he mainly focused on any percent. Within the first few months of the game's release, he had managed to set multiple any percent world records, getting his final world record in early 2018 with a time of 1:04:50. This player would be none other than Valu, and for the next 2 years, he would back off of Odyssey. But when 2020 came around, he decided to pick up Darker Side, starting the year off with a 3:15. Even though he was 7 minutes behind the record, Valu remained determined. After 6 months of grinding, he had closed the gap from 7 minutes to a minute and a half. While his movement wasn't on par with Dangers just yet, he was now going for all of the big tricks.
Finally!
While Valu added a few small strategies throughout the run to make up for places in which he was still slower than Dangers, the main kingdom he saved time in was Darker Side. It was known for a while that you could skip this flower road in its entirety using Yoshi and these blocks, but since it was at the very end of the run, nobody had the guts to go for it on a world record pace. Not only did Valu nail this skip, he also skipped using the up route to skip this freezing water section, as it was figured out that going through it was just a few seconds faster. As I mentioned earlier, Valu was a world record level speedrunner in the Super Mario Galaxy games, and like a lot of this game's early world record holders, he had a history of top level speedrunning experience that dates all the way back to the early 2010s. When Valu got his 3:06:45, he made a decision to move on from Odyssey, leaving us with one last comment. To most, this is just a sentence, but to me, it's a profound statement. In all of Valu's years of speedrunning, this was one of, if not his most brutal grinds. Darker Side was no longer a world record that was going to drop every week. It was now a prestigious world record that would only be beaten through the blood, sweat, and tears of anyone who was still crazy enough to go for it. While Valu and Dangers were getting world records, there were two more players who decided they want to give Darker Side a try. Neither player had much speedrunning experience outside of Odyssey, not to mention that they weren't at the top of the leaderboards as far as any other categories were concerned. Among the two players, 04 Dude 3 would start to improve at an unprecedented rate. When Valu got his world record, nobody even thought of 04 Dude as a world record competitor, as he wasn't even in the top 10, but after a few months, he had propelled himself all the way to 3rd place. By the end of the month, 04 Dude had skipped 2nd place, catapulting himself straight to 1st. This world record is no longer available, but nonetheless, it was the beginning of a new era, and right beside 04 Dude was BP31, and BP31 was just as determined to get the Darker Side world record. Even with 2 unintentional deaths, alongside a slip-up during the mech fight, BP was still able to cut over a minute off of the world record. While a lot of this time save came from a combination of both better execution and luck, there was one painful trick that BP decided to put into the run. In most kingdoms, there will be an area that is only accessible through wearing a certain outfit. In Lake Kingdom, there's an outfit room that requires you to put on swim attire, with the goggles costing 5 regional coins, while the rest of the outfit requires 10 regional coins. Not only is it very slow to get these purple coins, it's even slower to go through the process of buying the outfit. This is where the classic RCC comes in, except this RCC is much more difficult. The clip is tight, the out of bounds movement is strenuous, and the trick itself is pulled off 2.5 hours into the run, as opposed to the other clips, which are all pulled off within the first hour. But if the trick is done on the first try, you save 12 seconds as you get both this moon alongside an additional Toadette achievement. Since BP got the trick on his 5th try, he only ended up saving 2 seconds, but now that the trick was in a record, it would now become standard for any world record contenders to consider doing this route, even if a world record without it was more than possible. 2 months later, an 04 Dude would snag the world record back from BP, skipping an entire minute barrier in the process. But once again, this world record has since been privated by 04. A few weeks later, the world record would once again be beaten, except it wasn't by 04, BP, or anyone else we've mentioned thus far. A random person coming along with an anime timer. It's a tale as old as time, except this wasn't just any random person. This was Tyrone18. All the way back in 2019, Tyrone would get his first world record in any percent, and ever since then, he would continue to dominate the category, getting world record after world record after world record. By the time 2021 came around, he began demolishing world records in other categories with little to no effort, as he had gotten so incredibly good at the game through grinding any percent. The most impressive part of this world record was that it honestly wasn't all too impressive. There were multiple parts in a run in which Tyrone lost quite a lot of time, whether it be this Death in Cascade 2 or opting out of strategies such as Outfit Clip and Sewer Clip. But after Tyrone snagged this record, he would stop doing Darker Side attempts, shifting his focus back to any percent. BP and 04 Dude were more than capable of beating Tyrone's world record, but for the next year, it would remain as a 303.43. So if no one was going to beat Tyrone's record, then that meant Tyrone was going to have to beat Tyrone. In the summer of 2021, his sum of best, or SOB, was a 301 flat, meaning that Tyrone would have gotten a 301 if he played to the best of his capabilities in every single kingdom. By the time it was summer of 2022, he had lowered his SOB all the way down to a 257.58. The only thing left to do was to piece it all together.
fucking go slow as shit. I don't care. Make sure you don't fucking fall off. What the fuck?
In the span of 3 weeks, Tyrone had improved the world record from a 3:03.43 all the way down to a 2:59.51. He had cut off a little over a minute every single week for 3 weeks in a row after no minutes were cut off for over a year. Tyrone would hold on to this world record for an entire year, with 04Dude finally beating Tyrone in the middle of 2023 with a 12-second cut, which is about where this world record history ends at the time of this recording, because after the 2:59.39, the world record would remain stagnant until just a few months ago, in which Tyrone finally decided to come back for another world record alongside the first ever 2:58.
Easy. Easy! Oh, I did split! It's not working! It didn't split! What the fuck? Yeah, baby! That's what I'm talking about! Yeah!
While the current world record is one of the most legendary Mario Odyssey speedruns out there, I am very confident that it will become extremely outdated within the next few years. So instead of explaining how this world record is possible, I will briefly explain what Darker Side's God Run would look like. At the end of 2023, Mark Lucas released a Darker Side run that clocked in at 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 28 seconds. What makes this run so much faster than the world record lies within the idea that it is a run that was segmented together by the entire community. While a player's sum of best adds up that player's best time in each individual kingdom, this run adds up hundreds upon hundreds of the community's best segments to create this monstrosity of a speedrun. While there are some exceptions to this rule, most segments start at one moon and end at another, meaning that players can spend as much time as they want optimizing that tiny fraction of the run. This isn't to say that there are unoptimized segments, but since most segments are both short and easily grindable, they reach 90% of their potential fairly quick when you then couple that in with hundreds of players who all feel incentivized to play their part. A lot of the major tricks in this run are also done in the world record, but with that being said, there is unique movement to be found in every single kingdom that is still impressive almost 2 years later. Speaking of which, this segmented community run has been out for almost 2 years, which means that it too is outdated. Shortly after Tyrone got his 2:58, the Switch 2 would be released, and with that came load times that were way faster than the load times on the Switch 1. Faster to the point in which every single category has now been split into Switch 1 and Switch 2. So if we take that 2:47.28 and put it on the Switch 2, then we're working with a time that is already dropped down to the 2:45 range. If we then account for Darker Side's most up-to-date route, which includes route changes to Metro Kingdom as a result of this out of bounds clip that lets us get this moon early, alongside a plethora of tiny optimizations, then we can very well expect our best theoretical time for Darker Side to go all the way down to a low 2.4x. With the release of the Switch 2, we have a new and exciting era ahead of us as the community waits for someone to beat Tyrone. 04Dude has been getting back into the swing of things, and I don't doubt that there will be newer people who come along to shake things up as well. But until then, this has been the history of Darker Side World Records.
As long as I've got you, then I don't care. Kick up the wall and take a plunge, tripping through 2 dimensions. What the